Welcome back to War is Stupid, an anti-war podcast about war. This is a very exciting episode as I am speaking to my first ever British guest, my first ever guest representing the medical profession, and my first guest who has worked with the Pentagon, which is incredible. Nicholas Wright is the author of Warhead, How the Brain Shapes War and War Shapes the Brain. And as a proud brain owner, I was grateful for the opportunity to dive deep. And I just gave Nick the spiel before we started recording, but for any new listeners, just to orient you to what this podcast is all about. My name's Orli Matlow. I'm a stand-up comedian here in New York City, which they say is like London, but slightly smaller. London with only two football teams, and it's a different kind of football. And I began this podcast as part of my political emotional journey as a Jewish person, being very upset by my community's reaction to what became to the genocide in Gaza. Whether it was inaction or endorsement, I really upset me, and so I decided to start this podcast to explore how we got to this point. And thank you, Dr. Nick, because your chapter on consciousness did an excellent job at describing what I'm trying to do with this podcast, which is improve the quality of raw materials flowing into our consciousness by giving our tapestry better knowledge in some areas and better ignorance in others. So thank you so much for using your free will to be here. Chapter 3 is about free will.
Thank you very much for having me on. And I was literally at Zabar's in New York City buying some coffee about 8 days ago. So it's a great city.
Oh, incredible. Did you get babka or a bagel, or was it just a coffee and run?
What did I have? I had some kind of feta triangle thing. It was very
Ooh,
nice. Yeah, it was very tasty.
probably
Yeah.
a feta bareka.
I quite possibly, but I have to confess, I was literally at that point running to go and get my train. So
That's a very authentic New York experience, is
brilliant.
being in a hurry. So please tell us about the book and how it came to be.
Yeah. Well, so as you said, so I'm a neurology, so I practice neurology medicine. So I treated patients with brain problems in London and also in Oxford. I helped with brain surgery where people were, awake, and then there were electrodes put into their brains. You can see how affecting their brain directly affected what they were feeling in the real world. It was really quite remarkable. And then I spent a number of years using functional brain imaging, so brain scanning, to look at how humans made decisions about things like rewards and punishments and risks and so on. And I did all of that at the lab in London where DeepMind, Google DeepMind, it was spun out of. And so, I've worked a lot on technologies like AI and so on because they're deeply related to how we think about the brain. And then I moved to Washington, D.C., and I worked with one of the big think tanks in Washington on thinking about nuclear weapons, thinking about how we could reduce the chances that nuclear weapons would be used. It was called the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. People have been striving for peace, obviously, for many decades, and that was an organization by then one of the world's richest men set up to promote peace. And so we were thinking about how we could reduce the chances nuclear weapons would be used, how we could think about nuclear weapons more clearly, how we could apply these ideas we were finding out about the brain to working with nuclear weapons and strategy with nuclear weapons. And during that time, I started also working with people at the Pentagon, in the Joint Staff at the Pentagon. And they were very interested in things like, how can we better understand people so that we can deter them better, for example, if we're thinking about things like nuclear weapons? And how can we influence them so they choose not to act, so they choose not to use nuclear weapons? Or if we did get in, heaven forfend, into a nuclear war, which is absolutely not impossible. And there were a number of times during the Cold War, for example, where that was actually extremely close to happening. How can we control escalation? How can we prevent that escalating to the point where, the whole of humanity could be could be obliterated. So these were really meaty questions, and they wanted to know about that. What's always been the central weapon of war and the central instrument of peace? It's always been the central instrument of peace. It's both those things, which is the human brain. And I've worked with them now as an advisor for over 10 years, and we've looked at many different things, one of which being nuclear weapons, but much broader than that, things like AI, things like how to defend against those who seek to sow discord within our societies. So I've worked with them for many years, and I was just really worried about probably about 5 years ago, that people just did not understand the risks we were running now in the world, that we could lose, the democracies genuinely could lose in a war, in a conflict, and in many different ways. And so I wanted to write a book that put together the very latest, all the most amazing latest things we were understanding about the brain, and put those together with all of the things that I'd been learning about, having worked so closely with so many different aspects of the military now for over a decade. And the idea is that we know a lot more about ourselves now. And what we can do, hopefully, is use that self-knowledge. Use that self-knowledge to avoid wars if we can, to avoid them escalating if we can, to win wars if we must fight them. And so I would say, and obviously your podcast is about peace. And that's absolutely, that's central to a lot of what I've spent a lot of my life over the last 15, 20 years working on. And I think we can get peace, a more peaceful world, through better self-knowledge of us as humans.
Yes, thank you. And you write that although you go into detail about the ways which democracy can lose in our time. What are they, and which one is the leading contender right now?
I mean, I think that's a really good question. I mean, we could think about say somewhere like the United States, or we could say something about Britain, or about Israel, for example. I know you were talking about Israel, and I think all three of these different ways that we could lose in our time, relate to all three of those countries. And when you say which is the most important, as a bit of a spoiler alert, I don't think there's like one. That's a key idea of the book, is that we need to see the bigger picture. And if we can see that bigger picture, we don't need to know everything about everything in the world, but we need to see enough of the bigger picture. And I think that all three of these ways of losing matter in our time, and there's no simple way of avoiding any one of them, without just by ignoring the others. So the first way is to lose a conventional war, right? So to lose a war over, if it's the United States, to lose a war against China over somewhere like Taiwan, and that's entirely plausible. So when I start the book in when I was in a cozy pub in North London in December 2021, and at that point, a number of war games up to that point had shown the United States losing a war over Taiwan. And people who work in the Pentagon, they were not any. A lot of people naturally assume, oh, don't worry, America's got so many guns and ships and planes and things, America's going to be totally fine. That is absolutely not the opinion of a lot of people I really respect in the Pentagon. So, and if anything, that situation's got worse. And wars between great powers, between really big countries like America and China, they often go on for years. Right? World War II lasted for 6 years for Britain. It lasted for 8 years for China. Right? These wars often go on for a really long time. And now China produces as much stuff as the next, manufactures as many things as the next 4 or even maybe 9 countries in the world put together. So in a prolonged war, it wouldn't be a flood of American tanks and American drones and American vehicles and ships flooding the world, as happened later on in World War II. It could well be exactly the opposite happening. So one way is to lose a conventional war. The second way is to have domestic decay at home. And I'm not saying we would have a civil war immediately. I think what's much more likely is that there would be domestic decay. So the regime would gradually shift until the only way to remove a leader is by force, right? And that actually happens a lot. If you sit in Britain or America, it seems like democracies last for a long time, because in Britain and America, they have lasted broadly. I mean, yes, there are pros and cons and problems, but they broadly have lasted for a long time. But for example, the Soviet Union only lasted for 74 years. China its current regime only just passed that. France, since 1848, France has been a monarchy. It's had 4 republics and it's had an emperor. Germany didn't even exist until 1871. And since then, there have been at least 5 Germanys. The same, Italy hasn't existed for much longer. So regimes are actually quite fragile, and we could lose through having a regime change. And then the third way we can lose is what I alluded to earlier, which is we could have a nuclear war. We could fight a nuclear war. And it doesn't matter if we kill 50 million Russians or 50 million Chinese and we feel we've in some way won a nuclear war. It doesn't really matter if 20 million Americans have died. It doesn't really matter how many Chinese people have died. That in any meaningful sense is losing. So fighting a nuclear war is catastrophic. So those are all the 3 ways that we could lose in our time. And there's no simple way of just picking one and doing our best to stop losing in one way. We need to think about all 3 of those different ways and use our wisdom to plot a path forwards. And I am optimistic that we can do that. We've done this before, and I'm optimistic that we can do it again.
Yes, I'm grateful because your book, so far as part of this podcast, has been without a doubt the most optimistic.
Oh, great.
The fact that we've dealt with these issues before and we could deal with these issues again. And I also, one part of the book that I especially appreciate. So this, you write, in July 1921, Mao was one of the small group that founded the Chinese Communist Party. By the end of 1931, their Red Army totaled 150,000 men. And we must remember each one a real person, an individual who had been perhaps swept up in war like my great uncle Sidney. So I appreciate you humanizing the victims of war when the majority of media and people would just happily see them as statistics. So Gaza is often referred to as the first live-streamed genocide. Would you say social media or modern technology, does it make people more empathetic or sociopathic? Like, what does the role of new technology play?
You're giving me a when did you stop beating your wife type question.
I'm sorry.
In what way is it a disaster? No. I mean, this is your job. So I think it's very important to say that all new, you look at any effective military and the way they portray themselves will always be, or any political movement, if they're going to be effective, they will use modern technologies effectively. And so, they've discovered a lot of planning documents related to the Hamas attack on October the 7th, for example. And the idea of having drones, so when they planned the October the 7th attacks, for example, very, very deliberately for, a couple of years beforehand, they deliberately. So a key idea in the brain is that we are affected particularly by things that are surprising, things that are unexpected. And the reason is that our brains are constantly bombarded with information, so we can't just process that information in a like a passive way. We actively create a model of the world, and the way we keep that model of the world linked to reality is, in particular, when the predictions it makes go wrong, when we get prediction errors. And so what Hamas did is they deliberately did not create surprises. They deliberately kept things very calm in Gaza for a couple of years at least before the October the 7th attacks. And then when they conducted the October the 7th attacks, obviously it was an enormous surprise. So for a wide variety of reasons, and one of those reasons being that they deliberately tried to make it as unpleasant and barbaric as possible. That was an explicit strategy. And that's surprising, and that cut through. And they, for example, if you read the planning documents, they talk about using drones. They were very clear that they wanted this to be broadcast, and they wanted this to have a big psychological impact on the Israeli population, on Israeli decision makers. So they were always, cleverly using the latest technologies, the latest means of creating psychological effects in others has always been part of war, and it is to this day. And for example, you see that in Israel, Gaza now. What has that done to what does social media, how does social media relate to that now? And again, you did ask me a bit of a, when did you stop beating your wife type question, in that, like, whatever I answer, it's a disaster. Social media is a disaster. And I think there is a lot of truth to that. So I think that, unfortunately, social media brings us things that are so vivid, so distressing, that they obviously have a big impact on us emotionally, a big impact on us in terms of their surprising and so on. But then once you've seen, and it sounds terrible, but once you've seen so many things that are all so awful, inevitably the impact diminishes over time. And this is also a function of the fact it's just less surprising. So the only way you can then cut through is to make it more surprising, more unpleasant, more provocative. And of course that it makes echo chambers and all the rest of it, full of far worse things. And I just say there's one other thing that I think is also really important about modern social media that wasn't even the case, say, 10 years ago. So I don't know if you ever travel on the subway. I imagine you probably do travel on the subway. And I don't know what it's like on the subway because I only took the subway very quickly, as I said, running from Zagos to the train station and so on. But in London now, when you're on the tube, right, our subway, people used to be, when I was a kid, people were reading newspapers or books. Then people started looking at their phones and they were reading Twitter. Now they're not even reading Twitter. Now all they're doing is they're looking at videos or looking at pictures. And I think one of the challenges we face now with social media is that how are we going to make wiser choices? How are we going to really process this and stop and reflect on this? Because we're constantly being bombarded by things we're not even reading. These are just images and videos, and they're bombarding us now. And we have no moment then to stop and reflect and think, well, what does this mean? Is this true or not? What's the context here? We can't reflect and see the bigger picture. And I think that's one of the dangers I see now with social media as it's working now on things like Google Shorts or TikTok.
Oh, that's an excellent segue into talking about AI. What has been your work with regards to artificial intelligence?
Yeah, so different things. But I'll just perhaps give sort of three things. So one thing is, it's really important to remember that so much of what we think of as being cutting edge AI arises from thinking about the brain. So, for example, both last year's Nobel Prizes that were given for AI, so both of them were very strongly linked to my research institute in London, which is a research institute that researches the brain.
Amazing.
So,
Congratulations.
yeah, I mean, not me. I didn't win a Nobel Prize, sadly. I'm sure it's next year. They must have just forgotten this year to. They called the wrong number or something. But so, for example, the reason why a lot of people talk about AI, were very excited about AI, was back in 2012 when there was a team led by a chap called Geoffrey Hinton, who had previously, he'd moved to Canada by that point, but he'd set up the Gatsby Computational Neuroscience Unit, which sounds super nerdy, but I'm afraid I am super nerdy, at UCL, which is where I spent some time, and where my second supervisor was of my PhD. And he literally was trying to use the way brains worked and try and use that to help computers do things better. And so he built clever ways of doing artificial neural networks, artificial brains. And then the other chap who won a Nobel Prize last year was a chap called Demis Hassabis. And so he and I shared an office for a little while. We had desks in the same office. And Demis's work, he was researching how do human brains, a particular part of the brain called the hippocampal entorhinal cortex, how does that help us imagine futures? How can it help us imagine things, ask what ifs, and use memories to generate new imagination and so on? And he used a lot of those ideas that inspired a lot of the way he approached AI, and obviously he's done very well out of it because he won a Nobel Prize. So that's one thing is, if you want to see the future, often look at where the brain's going. And that tells you, for example, when Mark Zuckerberg talks about augmented reality, a lot of people laugh. But actually, the way you see the world is augmented reality. It already is. Your visual perception, your auditory perception already is augmented reality. And so I think he's right. I think augmented reality really is going to be a huge thing in the not too distant future. So that's one thing. We can see the future better with AI. And I've helped people talk about that. A second thing is, how will it matter for things like domestic regimes? So I published a book with lots of scholars from Harvard and Stanford and whatever, looking at how China in particular is using AI to monitor its population and exert control over its population. And so that's a whole extra set of uses I think is really important. How is it going to change the character of our societies? And it's going to change the character of American society. It's going to change the character of UAE or Qatari society, and it's going to change the character of Chinese society. And the question is, how is it going to do that? And that's going to be flavored by the different ways those three countries, for example, organize their societies. And then one last way I'll just talk about, which I think is obviously brings together two of my sort of main areas of work, which is about humans and machines working together. So how can you work with AI better? How can we collaborate? And that's going to be really important. So a few weeks ago, for the very first time, it was released that there were a little swarm of robots had been used in Ukraine, and it's the first time it's been done anywhere in the world, were used, and those robots had been given a target by their commander, and that little team of robots had worked out itself how to apply lethal force to that target, right? How to kill people in that, right? That were targeted. Now, that is what a lot of war is going to end up being in the not distant future. A key part of it will be these teams of robots, these swarms of robots, and there will be humans sitting on top of those, metaphorically, not literally. Well, maybe they will be riding them like a horse. I don't know. You're the comedian. I'm not going to make
Yeah.
that joke. But they will be sitting on top. Those robots will be making decisions, and we as the humans, or the humans controlling them, will be sitting on top of that decision making, deciding what those robots should be doing or not doing. And so a question then becomes about how does the human and the set of robots, how do they communicate with one another? And that requires the robots understanding how humans communicate. Right? If we're going to communicate effectively so the human can communicate their intention to the robots and the robots can communicate what they're doing to the humans, if we can do that effectively, it's going to require understanding the human side of that communication every bit as much as it does understanding the robot side of it. So that's another type of area that I've been working on, these human-machine teams and how we can make those more effective.
Wow. And would you say, does that make war less lethal or more lethal if there's fewer humans involved, but also the capacity is beyond our imagination?
I mean, I think it, and this is why we're going to have to be wise because we can take that technology in many different directions. So to give you an example, again, if we think about what's the most dangerous technology we have right now, and probably for the near future, it's going to be nuclear weapons. AI is nowhere near as dangerous. The only thing that could kill everybody half the population of America tomorrow afternoon is nuclear weapons. AI is not going to kill half the population of America, tomorrow afternoon. And the idea that some super intelligence will come and then it will manipulate the government of America into firing nuclear weapons against the government of Russia. As someone I know who said, I was discussing this with him, and he was like, do they know how difficult it is to overthrow a government? It's really hard to manipulate people into doing things. The idea that some super intelligence is going to do all this is, I think, a little bit far-fetched. So we need to, certainly for the foreseeable future, so we need to be a bit, realistic about what the biggest dangers are, and that's things like nuclear weapons rather than AI. But you're absolutely right. You're totally correct that AI really could make a big difference and it could go in different directions. And I think what we're going to have to do, for example, is build AI that has morality built into it so that it can make more just decisions. So say, for example, now that's difficult because human morality is inherently slippery. It's very difficult to get to it. So we've learned a lot about how it works in the brain, and we're going to have to apply that to build that into the way that AIs operate. But I think we're going to have to do that. And if we don't, then when you send, for example, because sooner or later, regardless of what you think about Gaza or Israel, whatever, there will be swarms of robots sent into cities. That's what would have happened in Ukraine if they'd already existed when in February 2022. The Russians would have sent in swarms of AI-enabled robots if they'd had them. How those robots make decisions can be more or less moral. It can be more or less, good. And probably the best way of finding out about that is to understand how humans make those types of moral decisions. And then try and build that into the AI. And we've learned a lot, and hopefully we can also build robots, AIs, that actually can make wiser decisions.
That's so interesting. So that's technology that doesn't exist just yet, but you do talk about technology that I didn't know existed, which is the $400,000 helmet for the
Who
F-35.
knows how much it costs now? It could cost twice as much or half as much. I mean, it's very difficult to know these days. Yes, sorry.
Yes, no, can you tell us about that and what it does?
Yeah, so it's just so now you have a remarkable helmets, for example, F-35s, which is the most advanced fighter plane in many ways in the world. And so you have a remarkable helmet that can overlay. So the cockpit is actually very small. The visual part of a cockpit that you can look through is actually very small in an F-35 in many ways. And so what they have is they have different types of cameras all around the aeroplane. And those different cameras have different modes. They can night vision. You can imagine all the different modes you can put it on. And so this helmet, which is, they make a specific helmet that's tailored to an individual's head, can look at things like where their eyes are looking and so on. And it can project different, it can look, you can change it to each different mode. So you can look through and it will use the cameras all around the plane to look. So you can look down, you could look down or to the left or the right, look through the bottom, you could look through your seat, you could look through your legs at what was happening below the aeroplane. And you can also then guide things using your eyes, so it can see where you're looking at. And it can provide you with information, useful information that will be provided, that is augmented reality. Useful information from conducting your mission will be displayed wherever you're looking at a specific thing. This looks like a hospital ship. This looks like an enemy destroyer, whatever it might be. So these remarkable helmets, what they enable you to do is link perception, what you're perceiving in the world, and it gives you all sorts of different new modes of perceiving, like binoculars, but obviously super duper binoculars. And link that perception directly to action. For example, using your own weaponry that you have on the plane, or to guide others towards that kind of target. So it links perception, enhances perception, links perception, extends our perception, and then can link that to action to help you achieve your goals, whatever, completing your mission, if you're that F-35 pilot.
And were the engineers basing it off of Iron Man? Like it's wild that we have art imitates life, imitates art.
Do you know what? That is such a good question. So like when ChatGPT came out, I did actually genuinely go back and I was like, I have to read Isaac Asimov again. And I was like, because actually, yeah, you're right. Life does imitate art. A lot of the trendiest arms makers now, if you could be a trendy arms maker, like Anduril and so on, they're named after Lord of the Rings characters or things from Lord of the Rings. So in many ways, art and life are linked together. And that can sometimes be very useful. So let me give you a really tangible example. So Winston Churchill was one of the most thoughtful leaders about how nuclear weapons, what they were going to mean for the world, how the Cold War was going to pan out, who should be building nuclear weapons, how should they be being built, right? So, and he was very thoughtful about that. He was actually a very, very widely read man. He had a huge range of, as you said, tapestry, as I said in my book, tapestry of knowledge. He had a huge range of different historical periods to think of and so on. And one of the things he had also to draw on was the science fiction of his time. And so before World War II, quite a few years before World War II, H.G. Wells, the chap who wrote The Time Machine and so on, he described the possibility of, I think it was a bomb that could be the size of an orange that could destroy, many city blocks. So basically predicting what it would mean if we got some kind of super powerful atomic style weapon. And so already there, that enabled Churchill to imagine what that could mean, and then how we would have to think about that. And imagination is so important. So we need to imagine possible futures. We need to imagine what could war be like, in order what could happen if we make the wrong decisions here, all the right decisions. We need to ask questions like, what if we do this, or what if we do that? And imagination is really important. As I said, Demis Hassabis, that's what he researched. He won a Nobel Prize last year. That's what he researched in his PhD, imagination. And that imagination is really important. And actually, I wouldn't be at all surprised if, even when they were little boys or girls, reading about Iron Man, that hadn't influenced some of the way they think about things.
You mentioned Churchill and Wright. We need effective leaders with appropriate self-confidence, clear purpose, good communication, because their task in great matters like war is fiendishly hard.
Hmm.
Is there anyone on the planet right now that you think can meet that standard?
You're not the first person to have raised that that
Yeah.
challenge. I mean, but then it's important to remember that Winston Churchill wasn't Winston Churchill
Mm.
for a lot of his life. He made mistakes. He changed his mind. Even during World War II, one of the things he did is he deliberately chose people to advise him who would argue with him. Right? He tried to give himself many different perspectives. So this is one of the things that so as his top military advisor, he chose a chap who was just simply quite aggressive and very forthright in his views, because Churchill didn't want yes men. He didn't want people just to tell him what he wanted to hear, because you need those different perspectives to interrogate what you're thinking, and so you can then together come up with better ideas. And that's something, for example, that Hitler didn't do. Even Stalin, actually, he ran World War II. Stalin was not a nice guy, but in many ways, that's obvious. But even Stalin ran World War II essentially by committee, the Stavka, right? Whereas Hitler became more and more and more. He started off when his great successes came militarily. Hitler's great successes came when he used more of a committee of people, more of a group. He took real advice. Right? He was definitely still the Führer. I mean, the clue is in the name there, but. He took advice. As the war progressed, he took less and less and less advice. He micromanaged more and more and more and more. Whereas actually Churchill, again, he was the prime minister for, from 1940 all the way through to 1945. And he deliberately chose people who would keep him grounded, give him new perspectives. And that's one of it's an interesting challenge now. So Vladimir Zelensky, right, the leader of Ukraine, he was a very effective and brave individual during the early part of the Ukraine war. Personally brave. It is no secret that the American and British governments said, Vladimir, let's get you out of here. We're happy to, take you out of the country. You're going to be assassinated. You need to leave. And he bravely stayed, and he could certainly have died, and he didn't. And it was very brave. And he was very effective in many ways. But this is a long war now. Mm-hmm. How effective is he now, 3 years in? It's not good. It's wonderful that he did all that great work early on and for the first 2 or 3 years. Is he continuing to be good? Does he have people who are willing to argue with him? Is he willing to change his mind? And that's an open question. I don't know enough about his inner circle to know, but that's going to be really important for whether he can be as successful a leader for the next 2 or 3 years the war may go on for, as he has been for the preceding 2 or 3 years.
Yes, what does stalemate or attrition do to the brain? Because what do you say that's the state the Ukraine war is in right now? 3 years in, it's not even on the front pages anymore, eh? Or
yeah, well, not here anyway. It probably is in Kyiv, but
yes.
No, you're totally right. I mean, I think it's really important to remember. This is one of the things that we tend to forget, because essentially Britain or America, we have really chosen to go. We didn't have to go, or certainly didn't have to stay for very long if we didn't want to in Iraq or Afghanistan. These are wars that we could choose roughly how long they lasted for, or whether we started them or not at all. But that's often not how great wars between serious military powers often actually end up. They often end up taking years. And it's remarkable how the will to fight. So that's, why would anyone stand and fight when they don't have to? So to another New York comedian, Jerry Seinfeld.
Yes.
I think I remember reading a New York Times thing, and he was like, during COVID, and he was like, There's this guy saying New York's done, New York's finished. Like, I mean, come on, you don't want to be in a foxhole next to that guy. And I think that's absolutely right. You have to have the will to fight. You can't just give up. Um, and one of the things is that actually, so for example, if you look at World War II, so many countries actually lasted for an incredibly long time in World War II. But sometimes there was a collapse. The will to fight collapsed. So if you look, for example, at France had fought for years in World War I and won World War I. But then when the Germans launched their offensive on May the 10th, 1940, right, even though the French had more tanks, more trained men, or the France's defenders, which is Britain and France, had more trained men, more tanks, more guns, more planes, the Germans outthought and outfought them. But then the reason why France collapsed in less than 7 weeks is because their will to fight collapsed. And that is still to this day a difficult thing to explain. I think it's partly the surprise the Germans managed to cause. I think there was political polarization within France. There were lots of facts that I can go into in more detail if you're interested. But one of the differences is that, for example, Germany, and this is not saying Germany was a better country at all. Germany, so in June 1944, there had been D-Day in the West, and it had succeeded. In the East, there was a gigantic Soviet-Russian brilliant maneuver called Operation Bagration that totally destroyed the whole center of the German army on the Eastern Front, took out about 500,000 Germans. And Germany, by that point, by the time both of those succeeded, there was no chance that Germany would be able to survive. And yet Germans continued fighting on for longer than France lasted in the entire war, right? And it's amazing how long people can carry on fighting for, even when there doesn't really seem to be any chance of winning. And that is to some extent what we've got to now with Ukraine and Russia. So a question of what does attrition do to the brain? It becomes a brutal slogging match about how creative can you continue being? How much grit can you continue showing? How can you carry on even when it just is going on for a really long time? And that really takes you down to the core of what it often means for those soldiers as humans and for those societies as societies.
And while we're on this subject of World War II, I think as important as the fighting itself is, denazification and de-radicalization is very interesting, and that I think we could learn a lot from. So how did Germany denazify, and how can that be a model to contemporary extremist groups?
Now, so obviously all models are wrong and some models are useful. So I'm not saying this, we take all of this, but this was the last major war between all the great powers in the world. And it's a very important historical case that we need to think about. And you're absolutely right. So I go on holiday to Germany. Germany's a lovely place. I love it. Genuinely, I really do think Germany's great. How do we get to where we are now from where we were in 1945? And it's very important to remember that also it took a long time, right? The first thing to say is it took a long time for Germans to change their ideas, right? So the World War II ended in 1945. Right. And again, the Germans fought literally, I don't know if you've ever been to Berlin, but you see where Hitler's bunker was. And, the Soviet troops were literally like just around the corner. And that's what that was. It was only when Hitler then killed himself that basically things ended. So they fought right till the bitter end. And then actually, even for years after, they did polling, opinion polling. And even say, consistently up to 1949, right? A majority of Germans believed that, Nazism was a good idea badly applied. This is years after clearly it had been a catastrophe to any, there was no, they'd found the concentration camps. There was no, I don't know if you've ever been to Munich, you can literally get on the metro and go to the concentration camp. It's not exactly hidden away. So even by 1952, right, a quarter of Germans still had a favourable opinion of Hitler. So it takes a long time. And so how can you do that? So the first thing to remember is, and this speaks directly to, the discussion you had right at the beginning about, Israel Gaza, is military victory was a major component of that. Like ultimately, the reason, it wasn't like after World War I, where Germany had been definitively beaten in the field. There is no doubt about that. But the Western powers did not go in and occupy Germany. After World War II, massive armies of occupation sat on the Germans for decades. When I was born, there was still a British army on the Rhine, right? There were massive armies there that prevented the Germans from doing anything, right?
Wow.
So that's part of it. Military victory is a key component of it. But that was never going to be enough. And so, for example, if you read Winston Churchill's big set of histories, he wrote a whole multi-volume history of World War II, and right at the beginning there's a moral, which is in victory, magnanimity. And so there was reconciliation, and the reconciliation is every bit as important as the conflict. It's every bit as human as the conflict. We are amazing at reconciling in ways that other animals can't do. We're really remarkable at that, cooperating and reconciling. And so, for example, after World War II, obviously there's the Marshall Plan, which is very famous in America. And in Britain, we sent food aid to Germany after World War II. And even at that point, we were worsening food rationing in the United Kingdom. Right? And yet we were sending food to Germany. So its reconciliation is so important. And they very skillfully used things. Obviously, they didn't say this is to do with the brain specifically, but what they did is they very skillfully used ways of changing how people could think about themselves, for example, right, to up their identity, the narratives of their lives. So, for example, what they did is that they created a new way. So even active Nazis, there was a study who looked at people who've been active Nazis, and how did they then become productive members of West German society? And it was partly about creating a narrative of a new Germany that had a conservative flavour, but they could contribute to that. And then the things they'd done, the parts of their lives that came before, could be fitted into a narrative that enabled them to be then Germans for the future. Their narrative self, the story of their life, could fit into a coherent story that then translated into them becoming Germans in this conservative but democratic West Germany that was productive and could get prestige from economic growth, for example. And of course, they could also see themselves, their social self, their in-group could be part of the West, as opposed to, in that case, you then had the Soviet Union in the East. So you could use identity, for example, as a way to help those Germans who'd been active Nazis become productive and much more peaceful members of a more conservative West Germany.
Yes, I'm glad you brought up identity, because in the book you cite the identity culture spiral as what makes war inevitable, which is very inconvenient for me, which means we have to discuss it. Yes, in your opinion, as a
So it's
student of
it's one of the
history and a
so I mean it's one of
doctor.
the things. Yeah, I mean it's one of the things. So I think unfortunately there's no simple one reason. So what is war? War is politically motivated violence that's serious between human groups. That's what war is. The human groups part is central. And we human groups, we humans who live in groups, we decry the idea, oh, there's like them and us and all the rest of it. But what is really remarkable is that we can form groups of any scale at all, right? No other primates can form groups of more than a couple of hundred individuals. And yet humans can form groups of thousands of individuals in tribes, millions in, modern states, right? How on earth can human brains enable us to get beyond, just a few hundred, right? That you would have, say, in the very largest chimp or baboon societies. And so that comes down to making humans whose identities are consistent enough with each other that they can work together as a coherent group. And that requires culture. So culture is, we can get very bogged down in definitions of culture, and no such thing as culture exists, or culture explains everything, or whatever. But a practical way of thinking about culture is that culture is how things are done around here. Okay, it's and that's something that happens in America. How things are done around here. Writing a resume, or not a resume, but anymore so much because that's probably done by ChatGPT. But writing when I got when I used to hire people in America, when I lived in America, and I used to hire people, I'd read people the letter of recommendation, I think you call it there in America or whatever, and there'd be like some professor saying, "This is the most amazing student I've ever met in my entire life. This girl, Orli, is probably the top 1% of students I've ever had." Right?
We love
And that's just,
superlatives here.
you certainly do. And that's that's how things are done in America. But in Britain, literally, if you wrote that, people would think you were a bit weird. It would just be like, "I've greatly enjoyed working with Orli, and she's been a real credit and a bonus to the lab." In America, that would mean you were a sociopath that under no circumstances hire her. In Britain, that would mean you were actually genuinely great. Right? So there are these cultural differences, even between Britain and America. So it's just how things are done around here. And that could be that can be in organizations, or it could be in countries, or big picture culture, like East Asians versus Western people, whatever it is. And I've done experiments where we've tested people in Iran and in America and Britain and China and so on, and looked at different aspects of cognition and so on. And just to say, cultural commonalities greatly outweigh cultural differences. So it's really important to remember that. Chinese people, yes, there are differences in cognition between, say, for example, East Asian people and Western people. And yes, we could have a whole discussion about what Western means, or East Asian even. But cultural commonalities greatly outweigh cultural differences. We're more similar to each other than we are different, although there are some differences. But anyway, so culture is really important. So you have, how on earth do we get to the point of having groups of more than a couple of hundred individuals? It involves culture, things like what is there what do gods look like? How do we cross the big river? How do we make a flint axe? All of these different things are things that we can, because of our uniquely human ability to communicate verbally, we can communicate that, and we can set up rules for how things work around here. And those rules, that culture, can help shape individuals. And then when I'm an individual, I'm like, who am I? Oh, I'm a British person. I'm a doctor. I'm a PhD neuroscientist. I work with the Pentagon. Those are all parts of my identity. And then they help reinforce, and then I then become something that helps reinforce the culture. And so you have a spiral of culture and identity, how things are done around here. Who am I? How things are done around here. Who am I? And culture creates identity, and identity creates culture. And we can create human beings who are in remarkable groups that can coordinate and cohere together well enough for us to live together, something no other primate can do. And that is wonderful. And it's part of what makes us the thinking, remarkable organisms that we are. And yet that is an enormously powerful set of forces, and it can spiral out of control very quickly. And that's what I was saying earlier. It's really important to think about domestic decay, because there's absolutely nothing to say that American society or British society or Israeli society won't fracture and splinter apart, or be steered in a terrible direction by forces beyond its control, or be subjected to tremendous forces from outside that cause it to crumble. There are so many things that can happen. But if we know ourselves better, if we understand how these forces operate, then I'm confident that we can do a better job of controlling them and dare I say it, make the world a better place, which is, I think, what actually most people want to do.
And so when does the identity culture spiral turn violent? Is it just when people have access to it, or is there scarcity?
I mean, I think it's partly that. I mean, if you think about it, it's quite a remarkable thought. So within living memory, there were only 2 billion people in the world. Right, 1930 odd, there were only about 2 billion people in the world. Now there are well over 8 billion people in the world. There are things that are much more serious than coronavirus that could, pandemics that could break out. There are lots of things that could happen, and you're entirely correct. That scarcity could be some of it, and I wouldn't be surprised if that kind of thing. We've faced many challenges like that in the past. We could certainly face challenges like that in the future. And when people feel threatened, they often will take, the idea violence will always be an option. Or, for example, you talk about Israel, Palestine. I mean, the simple fact, in my opinion, is that if Israel didn't have a powerful military, the chances that it would exist as a state with many Jews living there is very small. Because for a wide variety of reasons, you can think about 1967, 1973, the wars. If Israel hadn't won those wars, those conventional wars, it's not totally clear to me there will be any Jews living in that part of the world now. On the other hand, and of course also Israel has a nuclear deterrent, which it doesn't declare, but it certainly has a nuclear deterrent. And I think if anyone doubted the Israelis would be willing to use nuclear weapons if that's what it took to secure the state of Israel, I think they don't really understand Israelis as well as they might do. So I think they're pretty tough guys. And they may well do. And so that also secures the idea that, that's because sooner or later, it's very important for people to remember, sooner or later, everybody loses. Sooner or later, everybody loses a conventional war. Sooner or later, Israel is going to lose. That is just simply what's going to, because sooner or later, everybody loses. And when Israel loses a conventional war, which eventually it will, even if we look at some really long historical time span, what's going to prevent Israel being completely? I'm not saying there'll be a, every Jew will be killed. I'm saying, but people may well be moved, elsewhere. So how should Israelis think about that? Now, one of the challenges then is living in that state where Israel, for example, has conscription in a way that no other developed nation does. The military is so much more essential part of Israeli life than it is in any other developed country. Obviously, that also produces enormous strains within society. And how can Israel maintain its military capabilities, which requires a whole of nation response, and yet at the same time not have that damage Israeli society and damage its democracy, because Israel is a vibrant democracy in many important ways. And that is a challenge. And there is no simple answer to that question. It's going to require wisdom on the part of leaders. It's going to require wisdom on the part of concerned citizens in Israel, on all sides of the political spectrum. And that is the best we can do. But Israel's come through these challenges before, and I'm optimistic that it can again, but it's not going to be easy. And, it's going to require wisdom and hopefully understanding ourselves better as humans.
Something I thought was funny in the book was you wrote about.
I like that segue. That was good there. Yeah, I enjoyed your segue.
Oh, thank you.
You're an accomplished comedian. Yeah.
Yes, I'm like reaching. I'm like, I don't have a punchline, but I do think it is objectively funny to think about Nazis on amphetamines. If you want to tell us about the role.
Well, I guess it depends whether you're on the receiving end or the yes, but
exactly. 80 years later, it's funny to imagine. Yeah, war is of course very solemn and serious.
So early on in the war, the Germans produced an enormous amount of Pervitin, it was called, which is methamphetamine. And they produced many millions of doses that were distributed, very liberally during the battle of against France. And by an amazing coincidence, it did enable those soldiers to carry on long into the night. So, in fact, a future Nobel laureate in literature, Heinrich Böll, he wrote, "Oh, Pervitin's great. Can you send me some more Pervitin? It makes me happy. Helps me. It keeps me more awake than cups of coffee." But then, of course, actually, many militaries have, throughout history, have used similar things. And so the British and the Americans used amphetamines, go pills, until relatively recently, actually. There's a drug called modafinil, which is a quite remarkable medicine, which I haven't actually taken it myself, but I helped conduct some experiments on it with surgeons. So surgeons in Britain, and surgeons often have to work all night, right? So they're surgeons. You work all night as a surgeon, operating overnight. Because someone comes in with an obstructed colon or something, and they need, they can't just go, "Tell you what, yeah, we'll wait till tomorrow, Mrs. Smith, and 10 o'clock tomorrow morning when everyone's in." You just have to do it. So surgeons are on all night. Now what we did is we would then they'd worked all night. They'd been awake the day before, they'd worked all night, and then we would give them modafinil. And what was quite remarkable, and then we'd get them to do not operations, we'd get them to do a series of tests. You'd be pleased to hear. Just this is not didn't do anything dangerous, but then we got them to do a series of psychological tests and so on about all sorts of different things. And what's remarkable when you spoke to them though about it is you're super tired. You've been awake all night working, and then you take this modafinil, and you genuinely, it's like Provigil, I think is the trade name, and it's like you're awake it's like, you're feeling completely awake. Like you've had a good night's sleep, which is quite remarkable. And now the question is, if there were, say, a major war between America and China, or like how far will people use these types of medicines? How far will we be seeking to develop new versions of these medicines? And I think the answer is obviously, we would be using such medicines, and we would seek to develop new such medicines. The question is, how successful would they be, and so on. And so, for example, you talked about the Germans. Unsurprisingly, they discovered that giving people a lot of methamphetamines caused problems later on. So later on in the war, the German medical profession were like, we really need to calm down on this, guys, give out less amphetamines. So they actually stopped that because people were committing suicide and having heart problems and so on. But, this has always been a part of how we've thought about war, and I have no doubt that it will continue to be so in the future.
So, what does the need for altered states, or I guess maybe it's not need, but if war is so natural and inevitable, the fact that it takes drugs in order to commit to the violence, is war not our natural state?
I think it's well, there's a lot of differences between different humans. So why do we humans reproduce sexually? The reason why we have sex, as opposed to reproducing asexually and just budding off, like I didn't bud, my children didn't just bud off from my knee or something. The reason why we reproduce sexually is in many ways so that we can produce offspring with a wide variety of different characteristics. So you have a variety of children, and some might thrive in drier climates, and some might thrive in, wetter climates. I'm not being silly, but you know what I mean? So you have a range of different offspring. Human beings are just really varied. And that's why I was saying there will always be a new Hitler. There will always be a new Osama bin Laden. There will always be a new, Vladimir Putin. On the other hand, there will always be a new MLK. There will always be a new Gandhi. There will always be a new Churchill. There will always be a new Orli, and there will always be a new Nick type, people who are probably somewhere less extreme, right? To the good or the bad. And so there will always be different people. And so part of it is about which of those people will do things. So in war. So for example, there was a very famous set of studies conducted, and there was a whole debate about the methods that were used and so on, but they're broadly consistent. They've been shown to be broadly correct. They looked at American soldiers in World War II. And even during really fierce combat, right, only about a quarter of these American soldiers would fire at the infantry. Only about a quarter of these soldiers would fire their weapons, which is really quite remarkable. So what did the rest of them do? So they would either not fire their weapons, or they would, for example, if they did fire them, they would kind of do posturing. They'd point their weapons in the wrong, in a direction that wasn't going to hit anybody. A recent head of US Special Forces said, in a typical platoon, there'll only be, a small number who will actually be effective killers, right? The rest of them aren't very good. That doesn't mean they're not brave. That doesn't mean they wouldn't risk their own lives, but they wouldn't necessarily be effective killers. But the thing is you need that. Like in World War II, if every British unit in World War II had just simply been full of people who were prepared to risk their own life but not kill any actual Germans, we never would have got anywhere, and it would have been an absolute calamity for everybody. So you need effective militaries, and those effective militaries will need the proportion of people who are, willing to fight and fight aggressively. And for example, that's what they lacked in France, in a key part of the Battle of France, that there was a lack of will to fight amongst key parts of the French military at that time. So you're right. There will always be things where we try and, there will always be things that we have to do to get people to try and fight harder and fight better. And that will be, part of it will be, I don't think drugs are but anywhere near the most important part of that. The most important part of that is training. It's identity. It's feeling you have a cause to fight for. It's all those things that, for example, enabled the Ukrainians to hold off the Russians in February, March 2022, when around Kyiv they were literally outnumbered 12-1. 12-1. And the Russians had more tanks, more planes. It was, total. Everyone thought that it was going to be a disaster. But the Ukrainians fought very bravely. They'd been trained by the British, the Canadians, and the Americans beforehand. They'd been given arms, and they defended themselves, and they pushed the Russians back totally from Kyiv. And they fought very bravely. They had the will to fight and fight aggressively, and I'm very glad that they did.
Yeah, that home field advantage. We're in the midst of the World
Yeah.
Series, but
No, that is very important. You're totally right. You're totally right on that. That was a factor. Yeah.
And as we wind down, you write in the conclusion that the active work we must do so we can avoid losing wars to people like Putin, avoid nuclear war, and avoid domestic decay. So, what are your doctor's orders to listeners of the podcast? Because
Well, I could say obviously buy the book. No.
yes.
So there are lots of practical things. As I said, I think that the way we can make the world a better place, the reason why I'm more confident now, I think you mentioned my uncle Sidney and humanizing and so on, so my great uncle Sidney, he fought in World War II, and he fought the whole way through World War II. He was there right up until the very end of World War II, fighting in Italy. He was a British tank commander, and he won a high award for bravery, and we're all very grateful to him in our family. And the book opens with a photograph of him on his 100th birthday when he was surrounded by loving family and whatever, and he's holding my son. So my wife is next to him, and he's holding my son, who's at that point a little baby, and we're down on the south
I have
coast
it here.
of
It's
England at this point.
it's
Oh yeah,
so
there we go.
sweet.
It is very cute. I would say that because obviously I find my son cute because I'm programmed to by my brain. But the reason why I'm confident, so my wife Marsha and I, our generation knows more about ourselves than Sydney's generation did, and I hope that my children, Hugo and Cece, will know more about themselves, can learn about things like, from neuroscience and all sorts of other things, and more history that will have occurred. They can know more than we did, and I think we need to understand ourselves better. And that doesn't mean pretending we're something we're not. It doesn't mean pretending we can be entirely peaceable. I agree with you that war is stupid. And in addition to that, sometimes you need to fight a war. We needed to fight a war, World War II, in my opinion, if you're British. I'm glad that we did. And I'm glad that we didn't lose, because if we had lost, it would have been a catastrophe. So we need to see ourselves as we really are. And there are just lots of ways that we can try and be wiser. Right. So we're finding out so much about how wisdom works within the brain. So, for example, I start at the brainstem right at the base of the brain, end at the frontal pole, this bit right at the front, behind your forehead. And that does some of the most remarkable things, which include thinking about our own thinking. Right. So you now, Orli, can sit there and you can think, well, how did I just come across? Or what was I thinking? Or what do I really believe about, Israel? Or what do I really believe about Gaza, or whatever it is, right? You can introspect, you can think, you can reach in and ask yourself what you're thinking. We can do that. We have that amazing capacity, and we can actually enhance that. So there are lots of practical ways that we can enhance that, make us better at introspecting. And that's going to help us with wisdom, because wisdom is about seeing the bigger picture about ourselves in the world so we can make wiser decisions. It involves introspection, and that's the case if you're looking at ancient Chinese thinking about wisdom, or I don't know about so much ancient Jewish thinking on wisdom, but probably involves introspection. I'll make that guess. But
Oh,
certainly, like ancient
plenty.
Greek.
We invented
Oh, there we go.
psychoanalysis. That's
Well, there we
one
go.
of our
Yeah.
best
Although
things.
that was a bit more recent.
Yeah.
Yeah. And did you know that Freud wanted to be a neuroscientist, but it wasn't well enough paid, so he became a psychiatrist? But that's a different discussion. If you go to the Freud Museum in London, but we can make ourselves wiser. We can enhance our own ability to think about our own thinking using things like, as I discussed before, about things like Churchill, using people to help interrogate our ideas, presenting our ideas to other people so they can tell us we're talking nonsense, because sometimes we are, and then we can change our minds, getting a better stock of analogies, educating ourselves better. So instead of just spooling through loads of reels, we can read a little bit of history and get a bit of a better understanding of some different ideas about options for how the world might work out. And if that sounds like something we can't fit into our lives, as I mentioned in the book, I don't know if you've ever been to Robben Island, which is where Nelson Mandela was incarcerated for many, many years in apartheid South Africa. You see his prison cell, minuscule, and yet once they allowed him to get books and so on there, he read and taught others, and learned so much about the world, and was able to make really wonderful, wise decisions. And if he can do it on Robben Island, or as Dwight Eisenhower did as a random, is when he was sent to Panama as a not particularly successful junior officer, and he then read lots and lots of history, right? And then obviously his career went stratospheric not long after that. If they can do it, we can do it. And I'm really confident that we can learn more about ourselves, we can make wiser choices, and we can never get rid of war, even though I agree with you, war is stupid. It's part of what we are, along with many other wonderful things. And I think we can make the world a better place. We can make it more peaceful through self-knowledge, peace through self-knowledge. And I'm optimistic we can achieve that.
Thank you so much. That's beautiful. Peace through self-knowledge. And to gain self-knowledge, I truly can't recommend the book enough. And it's never been easier to learn about history, whether it's by getting a book or downloading a podcast. You don't have to be sent to prison or Panama. there's
or
no
prison in Panama.
Exactly. There's truly no excuses anymore. So when people wanting to learn, where can they find you?
Oh, so obviously the book is on all the big. So I was in Barnes and Noble actually last week. So all the big bookshops, Barnes and Noble or Amazon or your local independent bookshops, so bookshop.org. It's an audiobook on wherever you get your audiobooks, Audible and so on.
Do you read it yourself? Because you do have an excellent voice.
I did read it myself, and I in fact got some advice from a friend who is a former, who's at the Royal Shakespeare Company, and so I can do a whole nother podcast on tips about how to do audiobooks. You need an apple, and you need a flask of hot water.
Wow!
And you can't speak the day before you do the audiobook reading, or like the evening before. Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing! And it's a long book, but you didn't need amphetamines to power through.
I'm not going to discuss my creative process in a way that can incriminate myself. No, I did not. I did drink a lot of tea and a lot of coffee. Coffee earlier in the morning, tea later in the day. But no amphetamines were used during. They really weren't used during the production of that book. You'll be pleased to hear.
Thank you so much, truly. Thank you for listening and or watching War is Stupid, an anti-war podcast about war. Please subscribe, rate and review, tell your dads. We'll see you next time.